Hello, welcome back to Verdant. This is the Genesis series, and Verdant Business Coaching is a reorganizing hub for small businesses which gives them a numbers dashboard on the background of an audit, outlines its processes, and converts them to step-by-step execution with support documentation. We also help you define your big why as a business. We offer startup foundational technical assistance and coaching. Okay, so we just looked at Abraham in chapter 12, and now this is chapter 13. We saw the risks of lying, even if it's on an instinct of survival, and the decisions made out of fear can lead to permanent collateral damage in form of relational divestiture, or what would you call it, like separation. And you need to be careful when you think you're being smart, because if you misrepresent facts, then that will ultimately lead to greater damage if the truth is found out, which it probably almost likely is to be found out. Abram and Lot separate. That's the title in the NLT, New Living Translation version. So Abram left Egypt and traveled north into the Negev along with his wife and Lot and all that they owned. Okay, so they went north. Abram was very rich in livestock, silver and gold. He had wealth already. So despite that, he moved around. He was not settled, but he was wealthy. It's a weird contrast, because we assume that most of the time, if somebody is wealthy, it's because they're settled, but there are businesses that do have a substantial amount of revenue and collateral, and they have established, in a sense they seem to have been established, but they have what you would call transient wealth. It's not fixed, it's not grounded. So one of the things that land represents is permanent or fixed assets. In the asset class, we have different asset classes, and it seems that the more movable or tangible aspect of gold is also important, because gold is almost a cash and cash equivalent. It's something you can trade. So what Abraham seemed to have is more of the tradable wealth, something that you can give easily in exchange for something else. If you needed, let's say, barley, you could give sheep or goat for barley, or sorghum or whatever. So he seemed to still be, we'd say, well-to-do, but in terms of movable assets. But the immovable, which represents solidity and permanence, he wasn't settled in that. So one of the asset classes that you want to build as a business is both the liquid assets, which is short-term or current assets, your cash and cash equivalent, your sellable goods. The livestock would represent that, probably the gold, whatever. But it seemed important to God that he actually established himself in a place, and that is where businesses get to have their own patents and patent rights and intangible assets, but also the more fixed ones, which include brick and mortar and land and properties, ownership of assets that are permanent in nature, not as easily liquidatable, but have a long-term identifier and strategic bearing, which means that over time they will actually appreciate, probably double, probably quadruple in value, but they have more long-term stay, more long-term durability, more long-term resilience, and they have a longer-term view for why they are in existence. It's not for you to sell them the next day, but for the shorter-term goods and assets that you can sell in a rainy day, you can sell. But for this other one, the fixed assets, it's really like to make a mark and for future generations and the future of the business as well. So it's the more to develop than to sell, Always have that in mind, because the asset classes are very, very, very different in functionality. They're things that you acquire so that you can sell if you need a cash flow urgently, if you urgently need a sum of money at a short time, in a short notice. But then the longer term view of assets or fixed assets is that you will develop them. So if it's land, you will build on it. And when you build on it, you build cash flow out of it. So they're supposed to generate more income, generate extra income, and over time develop or increase your worth. So he needed to still have that bit. Although the beauty about Abraham is he wasn't cash poor, because sometimes people get asset rich and cash poor, meaning that if he needed a quick fix, he easily could have the capital to trade and get the money he needed at a short notice. He could go to the market and sell his sheep. He could trade his gold and silver for, to buy assets, to buy land, to buy, whatever, goats and camels, and that was transportation. So, yeah, he had that. So from the Negev, they continued traveling by stages toward Bethel, and they pitched their tents between Bethel and Ai, where they had camped before. So they went back to a place where they had been, meaning that they probably didn't get a more suitable place than that. So usually going back to revisit is termed, well, it could seem like a negative thing, but it's good to go back just in case you haven't gotten a better solution. Go back to the place where you had been before, or you had camped before. It's okay to revisit, because you may see something new from those notes to the meeting, or from that prototype that you had disowned or is stalling. It's okay to go back and check. Probably you will see things differently. Review the books of accounts, review literature, review your videos of things that you're capturing on record, your videos of meetings, whatever it is. And then he continued to travel by stages toward Bethel, and they pitched their tents between Bethel and Ai, where they had camped before. This was the same place where Abraham had built the altar. So the interesting thing about the presence of God, it says, and there he worshipped the Lord again. The presence of God is so tangible sometimes that you need a physical place to identify the presence of God with. Because once you invite the presence of God, you can always go back there for new ideas. It's exactly what Abraham did. He built an altar, and that altar represents a meeting place between him and God. And that means you could always go back there for inspiration, because he had seen God there once before. That means whenever his faith was wavering, that seemed to be the best place to go. So even as a business person, you need the place where you meet with God in a physical sense. I know we said create an Eden, blah, blah, blah. But you could still have like a retreat, a place of retreat. It could be you who owns it, or the company owns it, the organization owns it, or even you can hire or rent it. Because if you find inspiration in a specific place, maybe it's when you hike a specific mountain or go up a specific hill or forested area, then you can go back and still have the answers you're looking for, because you've established a bond with God in that particular space. You have established a bond with the place, and God has accepted that place. That means he is actually indwelling within that place. It could even be a church. Some people have amazing connection with God within a cathedral or a church, a physical sanctuary, a place where You can go there physically to meditate, to just spend time with God. And I'll keep emphasizing this because, as we said, God is your founder, partner, because you didn't do this alone. So he worships the Lord again. This word again is so important. And there he worships the Lord again. Worship attracts the presence of God. It's from a place of gratitude. Even however stressed you are, if you just begin with worship, you start to praise and you start to pray, it calls down the presence of God. It invites God. It brings down the walls even in you, because now you're open for communication. You're open to the divine. You're open to the eternal. You're not just seeing the physical and the present. You've actually transcended all that. And now you're open to communion with God, which is why he will come. He won't come just because you're singing or you're reading a psalm or whatever, but because your heart is open, and worshiping God opens up your heart to his heart, and lets down your guard and your ego, and just opens up to a realm where he dwells, where you come up to him, so to speak. So he meets you halfway. He comes down, but you also got to come up to him. So Lot, who was traveling with Abram, had also become very wealthy with flocks of sheep and goats, herds of cattle, and many tents. It says many tents. But the land could not support both Abram and Lot. Okay, with all their flocks and herds living so close together. So sometimes you go to a place and you realize that even in a physical premise, you're renting out two businesses in the same complex or whatever. And you start to realize your parking is not enough, and that's just in a physical sense. Your parking is not enough for both of you. And even the same line, when it comes to markets, you realize that your competitor is really coming onto your territory, and you either need to rethink that territory, or you need to rebrand, or need to change your product altogether, or find a new place to market your goods. So sometimes the inadequacy of space could be in a physical sense or an intangible sense, whereby you realize that you're just not able to share a market, a territory, a market. There are too many similarities. You both have too much power. And sometimes it calls also for a merger or an acquisition of another, whereby one has to be subject to the other, or one has to leave altogether. Okay. So in this case, there was no way Lot was going to be acquired by Abram, because he was an adult with his own assets, with his own family. As the word of God has just told us, he had his own flock of sheep and goats and herds of cattle and many tents. He wasn't a child. This was his own property. So guess what? The land could not support both him and Abraham, with all their flocks and herds living so close together. So disputes broke out between the herdsmen of Abraham and Lot. And whenever you're in a squeezed place and you're getting into each other's space, this is going to happen. There will be dispute. Disputes will break out, and wrangles, and supremacy wars. You do not want to do that. At that time, Canaanites and Perizzites were also living in the land. So you not only have the internal wrangles, you also have the the original owners, the rightful owners of the land, also dwelling among you. It's a very complicated mix of territorial climate, because Abraham had brought in Lot as his underling, or under his charge, pretty much like you'd bring in someone that you're mentoring, and maybe make him the managing director while you're the director or CEO, whatever. And suddenly you have such strong opinions, both of you, and you're equally matched in terms of how much you're bringing to the table. Maybe it's a 50-50 or whatever. But along the line, you realize that there's also the environmental competition. The competition has its own life from an external point of view, and you have to take care of that. Like, the land is not enough. The land is not enough. You both have wealth, you both have an opinion, you both have a stake, but then you also have a context, which is that, business has to happen. You got to sell. And there are constraints to that because you don't own the entire universe of the markets, or you don't have enough supplies, or you don't have enough raw materials, or you have some sort of constraints on how much you can do in that area because of the outsiders as well. So I'm just trying to paint a picture where you have both internal wrangles and external environmental issues. And what that is likely to do is it causes strain on you because it makes a ceiling, or creates a ceiling as to how much you can expand and how much you can do, which brings in a constriction. It's a bottleneck, it's a constriction. You're tightly squeezed both within, because of the systems within your immediate environment, and even without, which is your macro system. So within the micro systems, there's a problem, and then there are strains and constraints, and then the macro system also has its own set of strains and constraints. So, as we're going to see, something has to give. So finally, Abraham said to Lot, let's not allow this conflict to come between us or our herdsmen. After all, we are close relatives. The whole countryside is open to you. Take your choice of any section of land you want, and we will separate. If you want the land to the left, then I'll take the land to the right. If you prefer the land on the right, then I'll go to the left. So sometimes this is what gives rise to spin-offs, because sometimes the segment head of your business organization is actually thriving and is the one carrier of the entire business, and segments head, or people who head a segment of a business that is carrying the entire organization, sometimes feel more powerful or as powerful as the CEO, because hey, my product line is the one that is paying the bills, is paying your salary. So at some point there will be struggles with other segment heads or even departments where they feel that they have priority because they're the ones that are bringing in the money, and they should even be promoted, or they should run the organization or whatever. So those kind of power struggles, now you need to decide maybe to spin off, to create a whole different organization for that particular brand. Or you could decide also that they need to find their own markets, because there's a lot of competition with the other products within the same organization. Now, in this case, it looks like two individuals who are working together, having a pull and a push regarding the resources that they have available to both of them at the same time. So what you call sister companies can be put in this category, where your brother or sister company, which you have raised, is competing for resources with your own company. And yet, this is a company that you began. And now maybe they're infringing into your regional territory. So somebody has got to either shift, or you wrap it up and close it all together. So because that's not going to happen, most of the time a rethinking has to be made as to which areas to specialize in, which geographical markets can be called niche, and which area will be for this other organization that you began with. Basically, maybe one has to go to the left and the other one has to go to the right. So a demarcation of resources is very, very important, especially when you have a group of companies or departments that are serviced by the same providers. So you have the access to the same resources, the same partners, the same fund partners, the same markets, and all that gets complicated because now, who do you give priority to? You're both equally important, and there's a relationship to think about as well. So it's just a scenario that will require different solutions depending on the different options that are available. But when it comes to resources, you probably want to demarcate the sources of funds from XYZ will go to this particular place, and the sources of funds from ABC will be channeled to this particular other separate line of business. Because otherwise, if you're all juggling for the same, and maybe one of you isn't doing very well, or one of you is more senior than the other, then there's bound to be a chaotic resolution. So maybe you should let there be a designation of the funds that are coming in to go towards a particular project, to go towards a particular business line, and not mix the two sources of resources available. It gets trickier, however, when you have resources of human capital. Again, you could also decide that, this and this employee will work towards this project, and this employee only works towards that project, which is now beginning to change because with the introduction of agile teams and having to have different expertise represented on different forums or platforms or committees or whatever, then that means you will have many shared resources, and those resources need to have a clear outline of probably what their line of priorities will be. So again, it will be tricky, but you could try and as much as possible differentiate the needs and the levels of importance for each employee if you're sharing them across different projects. So overall, something had to be done, and in Abram's case, Lot took a long look at the fertile plain of Jordan Valley in the direction of Zoar. The whole area was well watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord or the beautiful land of Egypt. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So he chose an area which would eventually be destroyed based on the short-term assumption of how it looked then. So, and this is a trap. At the point of making a decision, something may look beautiful, and there is no indication that things are about to change. So a proposition could look very, very good on paper, and the assumptions are right, and you think that, there's a future into this venture, but not knowing that down the line, that very source of attractiveness of that venture will attract people who will lead it to its downfall. Like it could be a wiped out business, or it would become totally obsolete as a service 10 years down the line. So forecasting, and I would say prayer, you need to ask God to show you which area to venture into when there is competition. At times it's just chance or luck, because you didn't ask God and you made rash decisions, but you're on the right track. But to be safe, I would say ask God for direction, because this man looked at the obvious. He looked at the cover of the book and decided, the land is glittering, therefore it is gold. And yet, all that glitters is not gold. So what is it that will define or differentiate for you what is gold and what isn't? What truly is gold and what isn't? So number one, you could do feasibility studies. You could do studies that project in the future. There's the kind of services that will be mostly prevalent or needed. And that is probably how we get into things like AI and robotics and chain block, because they will be useful technologies to go along with everything else that is changing in the world in the future. So it could be at a level of intelligence that you need to tap into and spend monies in research and development and in skilling people to forecast and, paying for the service to forecast. But I would say also just add prayer to that, because as much as you have the technical, let the technical back a hypothesis, and let your hypothesis be based on what God has told you or your instinct about such things. So sometimes even what papers or graphs reflect is not accurate, because things do change, and then there are hidden forces that you didn't quite know about that come up to the surface, and they taint and change everything, or they clear up something that was a gray area, and all of a sudden there's clarity and it's clear that you are wrong. So needfully you need internal and external sources of conviction, or internal and external sources of information that will inform your decisions. There's something called data-driven decision making, which is really important. You need to make decisions based on data, but also let it be in support of something that you've already concluded for yourself. And I would say concluded for yourself in consultation with God. So Lot took a long look at the fertile plains of the Jordan Valley in the direction of Zoar, and the whole area was well watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, or beautiful land of Egypt. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Lot chose for himself the whole Jordan Valley to the east of them. He went there with his flocks and servants, and parted company with his uncle Abram. So Abram settled in the land of Canaan, and Lot moved his tents to a place near Sodom, and settled among the cities of the plain. So he took a place that was already established. Like, it seemed like there were people living there already, and so there's the infrastructure, the services. The city, of course, implies that there was already commerce, industry, and all that. And it seemed like a place that, he just needed to plug in, and very little initial costs, very little by way of setting up anything, just plug and play, right? But unknown to him, verse 13 says that, but the people of this area were extremely wicked and constantly sinned against the Lord. So he said that if there's one person or stakeholder that can wipe you out in the blink of an eye, it is God. If there's also a stakeholder that can establish you in the right path at a short time, it is also God, because he owns everything. Now, the same stakeholder that is for you could be against people associated with you. In other words, maybe you're not the one that is on the wrong side of God, but there are alliances that you have built with people who are not walking in the favor of God. So guess what? When it's time for them to go down, so are you. You're going to go down with them. So that's why we said in the case of, I believe it was either Cain or Abel or something. There's a story where we were looking at the wickedness of men and people who bring you down because of the spiritual aspects. The spiritual aspects are very, very important. If people are aligned spiritually to the wrong things, their practices will also reflect what they believe, and their spiritual or religious beliefs could work against you. And as much as they may be a powerhouse or a force to reckon with in the industry, they are well known, they're established, they seem like a good party to roll with, they may not be. They may not be. And we're talking about giants before Noah's time. There were giants, and these were men of renown. But God was mad at that whole generation, meaning that they were also wicked. And he wiped them out in a flood. And we're about to see another wiping out of the wickedness of man. So the dysfunction will affect you. Their spiritual decadence and moral decadence. Spiritual usually goes with moral. Is going to affect you if you're in upright standing with God yourself. So think about your alliances and who you align yourself with, because by the mere fact that you have aligned yourself with them, means that whatever affects them affects you too. Whatever makes them fall will make you fall too. Don't just look at the benefits, the fact that they have tapped into the right markets and they can pull you along in the right direction, which is where they're heading anyway. Think about the things that are also working against them, because those will also work against you too. Right. So after Lot had gone, so the reason why they were wicked, and so there are two things working here according to NLT. The people of the area were extremely wicked and constantly sinned against the Lord, meaning that they were grieving the heart of God, and God is a God of justice. Sooner or later, things began to unravel. After Lot had gone, the Lord said to Abram, "Look as far as you can, see in every direction, north and south, east and west. I'm giving all this land as far as you can see to you and your descendants as a permanent possession." So I guess again there's a time for regrouping, and this departure of Lot must have affected Abraham a lot, because this is his nephew that he loved, okay? But remember, the initial vision of God for Abraham was that he was supposed to leave to another country, him and his wife. So he brought along a third wheel that was costing him. But also God needed to reassure Abraham of his promise. After Lot had left and he's mourning this fact, he may have lost sight of the original plan. And that's what happens sometimes when you have shakeups and upheavals. You lose sight of the original blueprint or the original vision that God gave you. The original vision was that you were supposed to take over the region. Whether you have to part company or part ways with a director or a key service provider or whatever, the vision must be retained for you to keep moving in the right trajectory or in the right path that God has carved out for you. So look what God says. He tells Abraham to look with his eyes, to look. So again, I see some of the movies I have watched, they have this notice board or whatever that shows them, like a vision board that shows them the places, the territories that they want to go to, and they have all these lights that blink that show the places that they are yet to cover, and you know, the areas, if it is geographical, for instance, the areas that are doing well, and then the areas that they want to get into, the markets that they're intending to get into. And the same case with us, we need that physical outlook to something that we can look at that represents the actual thing, where it's just a representation. In Abraham's case, he looked and he saw. He looked and he saw what God had promised him initially. Now, depending on what you're trying to conquer, the giant that you're trying to conquer, you can actually go ahead and look at it physically or have a representation of it. Some people have small globes on top of their desk, or they have flags in their offices that represent different nationalities. And all those are representations of what you can look at to remind you what the original vision was in terms of establishment and territorial dominance. Remember, we say that God's plan is always that we dominate. You dominate, meaning that you should be ruling, not being ruled. In cases where you're not ruling, that means that you could be suffering or being used under the disguise of surviving. You're actually being used as a stepping stone by somebody else, which means that sooner or later you'll be wiped out of the market if you're non-performing, if you're a non-performer. So here we go. We see now Abraham look as far as he was told. Look as far as you can, see in every direction, north and south, east and west. I'm giving all this land as far as you can see to you and your descendants as a permanent possession. So he actually calls it a permanent possession. Why? Because so far they've been sojourners, they've been travelers. That wasn't their will. It was against their will. But remember, even as they're traveling, they are noting areas, they are forming a background, they're gathering intelligence, They're seeing the places they would like to stay and they don't, and the places they don't want to begin. Where to start is also important, because the places you begin your business from that are hard and extremely difficult ground, you start with the easier things to master, so that way it's easier along the way. But again, there are different factors to consider, okay, as to where to first be established. And that's why I said, ask God, ask God, ask God about everything. Form your intelligence, but also ask God as a permanent possession. And I will give you so many descendants that, like the dust of the earth, they cannot be counted. Notice that the promise of the territory came before the descendants came. In other words, you have to have the vision of what you want to conquer even before you get the capacity to actually conquer it. Because it is obvious that Abraham as a man was not going to acquire the land alone. He wasn't going to possess it and inhabit it as a human all by himself. And that is why God said to him that as far as you can see in every direction, north and south, east and west, I'm giving all this land as far as you can see to you and your descendants, meaning that this promise outlives his life. It actually flows to his descendants, and the vision will continue and will be passed on generation after generation. The same case with businesses. We start knowing where we want to go, but it is not obvious, or it may not be the case that we are the same ones who will carry the organization towards fulfillment of that vision. It could be some a track that we have laid out and connected the dots as to how we will get there, but somebody else will actually get the organization to that point. It may be a 500-year plan, okay, maybe 50, and it will require different phases at different times to carry on towards the vision. So the drivers may be different, and the drivers of the vision could be different, but in its eventuality, we must be able to paint a very clear picture and be able to see clearly where it is that we want to go and where it is that we should land eventually. And I will give you so many descendants that, like the dust of the earth, they cannot be counted. Go and walk through the land in every direction, for I am giving it to you. I am giving it to you sounds to me like a present continuous. I am going to be giving it to you in stages. Remember, we talked about stages. So movement in stages, also acquisition in stages. Knowing very well what you want eventually. Now, some people start to build and then they continue the building upwards. But when they laid the foundation, they knew that they were going to go up 11 stories or 20. But when they built, they rested at different times, depending on when the resources were available and when the capacity was built enough for the next stage. So again, you're not going to arrive at your destination overnight. Rome was not built in a day, but there was definitely a plan of attack that envisioned the entire whole of Rome belonging to the Romans. And that's where you begin. What do you want to acquire? And then how do you go about acquiring it? Stage by stage, step by step. So God's way of guiding this process for Abraham was to tell him to go and walk through the land, okay, in every direction physically. So take that tour, drive around, walk through, or drive, or get a video, a simulation of whatever it is that you want to conquer, and get a feel of it. Get a feel of it. Let your senses be soaked in it. Create a similitude, or create something that is as close as possible to the reality if you cannot go and get a physical visit. So go through the land, go and walk through the land in every direction, So cover all the bases up to the nitty-gritty. This is your vision after all. If you're not able to define it, if you don't know it like the back of your hand, nobody else will. So Abraham moved his camp to Hebron and settled near the oak grove belonging to Mamre. There he built another altar to the Lord. So notice that wherever Abraham went, he took the presence of God with him. He created, he brought in, he invited the presence of God toward him, so that his life would not be a struggle, that he would have the counsel of God continually in his presence and among his people. And that is a habit I would say you want to form as well. Constantly build an altar at whatever point or stage of your business. Recognize the supremacy and the help of God, His mercy, His grace, your dependence upon Him at every stage, wherever you're at, whether it's a good place or whether you deem it as a bad place, whatever. See to it that the presence of God is always among your business. Thank you for watching and for listening, not watching, but you're also going to be invited, and you're invited as well to listen to the next couple of chapters. This is the series on Genesis by Verdant Business Coaching. Thank you and have a blessed time. Bye bye for now.